Back next episode of Key Points. I'm here with Brian Murphy again. Hey, Brian, how's it going?
Hello, Andy. Pleasure to be here, as always.
Yeah, fresh off of our first conference trip in, probably over 2 years for you. Year
It
and a
was
half.
it was wonderful to be back in the real world. It felt like pretty close to normal, so that was really nice.
Yeah, no, it was good to get out and actually see people for the first time in a while.
Yeah, and,
So
and AACC conference is a great conference, so that was neat to be at.
yeah. So the AACC, for those of you tuning in, American Academy for Clinical Chemistry. It's all focused on diagnostics. So blood, saliva, urine, you name it. Every type of sample and every type of analytical method out there. Saw a couple of our clients.
Nice. Yeah, no, there definitely it was amazing to see how many companies out there we've had some connection to.
So our last episode, we talked about building and managing teams, but we want to get into that a little bit more detail. So I guess, what are your two cents to kick off this topic on building teams, given that range, startup and global company?
Yeah, and I think specifically, from the engineering perspective, I think that's where I have the most experience. So maybe I'll speak to the engineering team side of it. There is inherently on almost all the products that we touch, or really that any of our clients out there are working on, they're going to be electromechanical. They're going to inherently have hardware, both circuit boards, mechanisms, and there's going to be software, right? At this point, there's hardly a device out there that doesn't have software on it. And so you think about that, how it kind of breaks down disciplines, right? It's going to be computer engineers, computer programmers, electrical engineers, mechanical engineers. Those disciplines are kind of, it's going to be hard to not have those on your team. So I would tell someone, if they were a new, head of R&D at this either startup company or even just coming into existing company, but they're trying to build out that team, looking, do you have those disciplines? Because, unless you're doing just the simplest of a new collection swap or something like that, you're going to need those disciplines there. And then obviously there's definitely supporting kind of engineering disciplines that kind of branch out for those, right? So maybe someone with more of a manufacturing engineering background, obviously that kind of overlaps with the mechanical and electrical side. Someone who's got a lot of good DFM background, maybe a systems engineer who kind of looks over all of those disciplines a little more. They've got enough mechanical, electrical, and process and manufacturing. So, that's another very common role that we see. Sometimes actually kind of maybe one of the most missed roles is having a system engineer. You need someone who's keeping in mind that big picture. So, those are a lot of the roles. And then you're going to have to kind of tailor it a little more to your product. So you kind of take any one of those disciplines and think about how that applies to your product. So if you're an electrical engineer, if you're building out your electrical team, is your product very complex from the power side? Do you need people with really strong backgrounds in kind of power engineering? Maybe your electronics have a strong kind of Bluetooth or RF connection where you need someone that's got a very custom antenna in there. So you want to be looking for people that have that electrical engineering background. On the software side and the programming side, almost all devices now have a mix of software and firmware. You want to make sure the people you're recruiting for and building out bridge that divide. Even if the device is primarily software based, there's likely going to be some embedded firmware, and they need to be able to understand how you communicate well with that. And also, I guess on the programming side now, with everything being so connected to the cloud, you're going to need people who understand how to then take that software, connect it up to the cloud, to the company's other products. I'd say it's particularly important if I was talking to, let's say, the new head of R&D at a large global company. Very good chance that global company already has cloud system where they're communicating with other devices, and so making sure that they bring people on their team that will understand how to mesh that well. So you're gonna want all of these different disciplines, and then also I would say bringing in on engineers who have experience working with assays and understanding some of the important details about how the people on the assay side, what decisions they're making influence the engineering side. So obviously you don't want people who are too green in that regard. Ideally, they've worked with the assay teams before and they understand how important things like temperature control are or volumetric control on fluid pumping or dispensing, things like that. So I don't know. I guess that maybe that'd be some of my initial advice I'd pass along.
Yeah, Brian, that was great. Yeah, and I think you identified a lot, pretty much every discipline you would need from an engineering perspective on a team to use the phrase from prior key points episodes, automate an assay, right? So the science is typically at the client site. And then I think that's really the question. Like, what team do you need on the engineering side? The question we want to discuss. What team on the engineering side, and arguably, what should you have internal at your company, and what should you rely on externally? I think one area that I think is maybe up for discussion that you didn't mention was microfluidics, right? So a lot of these companies and diagnostic assays require microfluidic control manipulation. Usually microfluidics is like a core technology. So I feel like we're seeing a lot of that expertise on the client side, but I know in the past, you know, teams that are built internal still need external help, particularly on the microfluidics, which I think is the heart of these platforms. So can you speak a little bit to how a team at a client site that has some microfluidic expertise can really leverage external expertise to get their assay, I guess, more robust and the platform more mature?
Yeah, I think that's a great point you bring up. I mean, at this point, almost every device has some well, almost every device has got fluidics to begin with. I'd say there's a fairly small subset of IVD devices that don't have fluids in them. And then from there, to your point, pretty much everything is moving more and more micro and even nano at times. And that's just for efficiency, throughput. The smaller you can drive down your fluids, right? The smaller and quicker, the faster you can process things. So it's a good point. You definitely want people, both internal and external, on your teams who have good microfluidic backgrounds. There's a mixture of kind of what that might mean. So that may mean you have some people on your team that have really deep analysis skills on microfluidics. So what I mean by that is, someone who has a PhD background where they have done some really complex CFD modeling of how fluids move through a cartridge. That can be really valuable. You can save yourself a lot of time, save a lot of testing time if you can do some really good CFD modeling to understand how is fluid going to move into a small cartridge and make sure it wets out all the surfaces properly, make sure air bubbles leave. And so I think that's a great expertise to potentially have in-house. If you don't, there are, external partners that you can work with. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in-house. And then I would say maybe a step up from, so we're thinking about modeling, we're thinking about very specific flow in a very small localized portion of, let's say, a cartridge or device. But then there's, as we kind of zoom out, like slightly more macrofluidics, even if we're in the microfluidic land, but where we're talking about now, pumping fluids through a cartridge or an instrument. And that's where you want someone who also, maybe it's a different person, but someone who has experience understanding fluidics from more of a pressure drops across a cartridge or a system, right? How, if they're going to get good pumping, what pressure losses do you have? How does viscosity play into that? Understanding the different kinds of pumps out there and pumping options. What, should you be looking at peristaltic pumps or should you be doing something more of a syringe pump? So I would say that's someone who's got good fluid experience, but also, understands maybe a lot of the off the shelf equipment out there that's used. And ideally, you internally on your team have some people that are familiar with these things. familiar enough to work well, to the extent you're outsourcing, can interface well with external teams.
Yeah, no, that's great point, Brian. And so yeah, we're kind of working from the inside out now. And I liked how you described, microfluidic expertise, but then more of like systems level fluidics control. So let's talk a little bit more about if you're trying to build a team, in 2021, it's very challenging to recruit. I think we're all well aware of that. And clearly you need a technical project manager on a assay based platform. So what are the absolute must requirements for traits for a technical project manager for these complex platforms? Because, you know, that is the one hire. If you're going to hire one person to run a project at a client site, whether it's a startup, whether it's a global company, you know, obviously you need to have assay scientists, but you definitely need a technical project manager. And then from there, it's kind of up to a lot of different factors, what your team internally looks like. But talk to me a little bit about the absolute must traits for a technical project manager for a complex electromechanical or IVD system.
Yeah, that's fair. I couldn't agree more. That position is so crucial. They're overseeing all of these other engineers, scientists, designers, and they need to know enough about all of those different disciplines to understand how they relate together. I'd say the must have trait is they understand where these different disciplines overlap and what are the most likely pitfalls of those overlaps. Years ago, someone told me kind of, every project either succeeds or fails at those overlaps, at the interfaces, right? The interfaces of disciplines, the interfaces of subsystems. If you don't get the interfaces right between your team members and your subsystems, that's where things are going to fall, because it's inherently those interfaces where you have the biggest weaknesses, the system, whether that system's people or so. I think, come back to your question, that technical project manager needs to know and anticipate what those interfaces are going to be, whether that's the interface between the cartridge or the instrument, or the interface between the software engineers and the electrical engineers, or the interface between the chemists and the people designing the cartridge. If they've had enough experience designing other systems where they have learned, potentially the hard way, where those interfaces are likely to fail, they can head those things off. And so they can make sure they're pulling together the right people at the right time for the right meetings. Sometimes as formal as laying out maybe an interface specification where you're literally detailing bullet by bullet how this part of the system is going to mesh with that. I think that experience from previous projects, from previous companies, if you can be hiring someone who can walk in and say, you know, and you ask them, what's your experience understanding interfaces? And they have a solid answer and they know exactly where things fail like that. That kind of experience is really going to make or break a technical project manager.
Yeah, that's great, Brian. And you stole my question.
Sorry about that, Eddie.
Yeah, so I was going to ask, yeah, this is the most critical hire or team member, right, for IVD platform development. What do you want to learn in an interview to make sure you're hiring the right candidate? I know you said, how do you define interfaces? But I guess my thought was, how have you handled failures, right? Failures in prior, because clearly you're going to want to hire an experienced program manager, ideally somebody who has IVD platform experience. But let's say, a failure that comes to mind to me is like somebody has run a cartridge based program before. You fire up the system for the first time with the first prototype of the cartridge and it doesn't work. And so we want to hear how that project manager, went about kind of separating effects and understanding why that first run of that cartridge didn't work. And so hear them talk through both at the system level, the cartridge level, and to your point, Brian, at the interface. So you want
Yeah.
to hear those things, hear how it interfaces to the instrument, and just let them talk you through that, because these problems will come about, for their program that they're being hired for.
Yeah. And maybe I agree with everything you said. The only word choice I would change is those aren't necessarily failures as much as more the unexpected.
Learnings.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's I think in any new cutting edge high tech device you're designing, there will be the unexpected. Like you said, you fire up the system, the alpha prototype first time you fire it up, guaranteed there'll be unexpected things. Even if you've done the absolute best job, you've planned everything out, you've developed good specification, you've done all the design reviews. Um, if you fire it up and nothing goes wrong, you're probably not working on enough cutting edge of a device. So there's going to be unexpected and unexpected oftentimes of you fire the system up and there's some unexpected thermal impact that affects your optical system. Some weird interface, kind of a multi-physics kind of interface, right? Where you were not expecting um, that the optical system could possibly be affected by this. And so you get that unexpected. And exactly to your point, okay, how are you going to handle things there? And to your point of kind of interviewing, getting their sense of what do they do at those times? How do they push through that? How do they problem solve their way out of it? Looking for, do they isolate variables? Do they fall back on looking at what kind of testing's been done to date? What are some ways that they can set up quick little experiments, quick little design of experiments to go through and say, okay, we think it might be a thermal effect on these optics. How do we test that? Maybe it's really simple. Maybe it's turn off the heater, but that's not that easy. And so, is there a way to put some interesting instrumentation in there to make measurements? You'd want to hear that they have gone through that experience, that they take it seriously, but they also aren't, they're not crippled when something like that comes up. They know how to pull the team together, get the right people in the room, come up with a quick experiment, and ideally push through it. If they've got that experience, if they've done that a lot, when they're working on that next product and the next product has a new technology on it, they're going to be cool, level-headed, and good at problem solving their way out of it.
Yep. Yeah. So you touched on something right there at the end that I wanted to bring up. So I feel like you're gonna find candidates that have been down that path before and solved problems, but it's the intangibles. What intangibles are you looking for in a project manager that would give you the confidence that they're going to be able to carry the program through all these trials and tribulations? You mentioned cool-headedness. I think that's a must. But and you yourself having run programs, like what are some of the intangibles that are required for a technical project manager for IVD platforms?
I mean, great organization. There's always going to be a million details on the project, being able to be organized. Also, inherently in any big program as a project manager, you will not be able to know all of those details. So I think being able to decipher out what are the key details you need to know and what are the other details you need to leave to your team members to know. As a project manager, if you get caught up trying to keep track of every single detail, you'll be lost. And so I think those kind of intangible qualities of being able to parse information, catch on what are the key things that you should be aware of. If one of your team members comes to you and says the mounting of this cartridge in the instrument, it seems like the fixturing of it is stressing the cartridge, and we are getting evidence of stress, mechanical stress in the cartridge. You may not need to go into all of the small details of exactly how that stress is being imparted in the cartridge, but you should be able to pretty quickly ask the questions. Okay, what are the basic loads on the cartridge? Did we expect those there? And pretty quickly be able to hit on, what are the key things here that might be driving the stress effects. So I think, and then coming back to your intangible thing, I think we mentioned level-headed. Maybe one other intangible is being able to draw on the strengths of your team members, right? Understanding where your team members excel the most and put them in the position to do that. So if you have a team member that's phenomenal at testing, knowing when the right time to draw in expertise is, or another team member that's phenomenal at designing, those people dynamics, understanding your team members, that's another big intangible thing.
So we've talked a lot about the technical project manager. I think we would agree that that should be your first hire when you're building a team, ideally, right? Because you can make progress speccing out your program and defining what needs to be done when, key requirements, all those things informed by their experience. What is the second hire that you would think would be, in priority beyond a technical project manager? And to help you answer that, let me just focus a little bit more. Again, you've got an assay science team that's demonstrated an assay on a bench. You've got, let's say it's a startup or a GM of a CEO of a startup or GM of a business, like that sort of experience is there. Maybe even like VP of R&D, and you want to translate this assay to a commercial product. What's the next hire?
I think if you only had one, if you were limited to this hour, you get one more hire and that's it. I think a system engineer, because I think ultimately, if you're that limited in hiring, ultimately you're going to be outsourcing the detailed design of the mechanical engineering of the software. But that system engineer is super valuable. As we mentioned earlier, they're the one overseeing all the disciplines, thinking about how things connect together as a system, thinking about, the to hit on the same phrase before, the interfaces. So I think that system engineers is a really crucial role, and you could bring that person on first, and then over time, build out the team below them, bring on more specific mechanical engineers, bring on more specific computer engineers, electrical engineers to kind of work under them or kind of in parallel with them on more of the details as time goes on.
Yeah, and then you mentioned other disciplines like optics, things like that. So I think that's where you get into the platform specific in-house hires, right? I agree.
Right.
Project manager, systems engineer, those are like two key ones. But then, if it's an optics, measurement, you're going to want some optics expertise. Probably came from the founder or someone of that ilk, probably already on the team, and then maybe additional microfluidics expertise as needed. All right, so we're building these teams to tackle these tough challenges, Brian. And again, I know you've run these programs, and I've watched you run them, and these problems have been solved and they're on the market. So I'm going to put you on the spot again here. So how do you solve these tough problems? And is it diversity of these teams that really helps get over these what seem to me insurmountable challenges?
I do think there's something about diverse mindsets, and particularly diversity in how you go about solving problems, that can be so valuable. I feel like there's, some classic examples. You'll hear sometimes in the engineering world, different schools of thought on how you go about solving things. There are even different schools of thought of, people from certain, backgrounds will come at things very analytically, right? The way they're going to analyze this problem is with equations, with modeling, calculations. There's also a very different mindset of how you solve an engineering problem, and that's with build it, test it, see how it works. And those are kind of like two very different schools of thought, and they both can be hugely valuable at different times. And if you have a team that is all on the analytical side, the calculations, the analytical, you're probably going to be hindered because you can't learn everything that way. And you may spend weeks and months building advanced models that are not grounded enough in the real world. On the flip side, if you have a team that's only doing the build it, test it, you may be spending a lot of time creating something that fails, and you're missing a fundamental physics aspect of it. So if I was building a team and I had my choice of people out there, I would want some people on that team that come at things from that analytical perspective. So that when we say, hey, why when we're trying to pump this fluid, is it doing this peculiar thing? They would say, oh, well, let me just do a really quick, I don't know, maybe basic Bernoulli's equation, maybe just run a quick CFD. That'll help me understand it. But maybe when I task my team with solving this problem, one person's going off to do those equations, that modeling, and simultaneously another person's going off with a completely different perspective on how to solve that, which is, well, I'm just going to go throw together a quick cartridge. I'm going to hook it up to a quick pump in the basement, and I'm going to run a quick test, and I'll be able to diagnose it that way. And in an ideal world, if you've got that team set up right with those diverse perspective on solving a problem, when you bring them back together the next day and say, well, what did you learn? Ideally, the person that said I'm going to build it and test it, came back and they have some interesting video of how it actually played out, and they learned something about physically testing it. At the same time, the person that did the analytical aspect of it comes back and said, yeah, I can show right here with this equation or right here with this modeling why that didn't work. So if you can draw on both those, and most people, their brain is wired a little bit more towards the one than the other. And I think that's a really good example. And you could apply the example I mentioned, fluidics, but you could take any other engineering problem. The pump isn't working, your heater isn't working, you're getting weird electrical noise. On the electrical noise is the way to solve it, to go back to base physics. Possibly that's probably valuable. Is it also to maybe throw it in some kind of, RF emissions chamber and test what's going on there? Yeah, it's really valuable. So I think in so many engineering things, if you can be both coming at things from calculations, fundamentals, but also from what quick tests can we do to prove it out? Those two things combined can be really powerful.
Do you think you can interview to tease out, as you're building a team, to tease out the mind that you're hiring?
Definitely. And you could take any one of those examples, toss out that challenge to someone. Say, hey, I just built this small little PCR related heater. This heater has to go up against a cartridge. And I ran my first test and I'm not getting the temperature ramp rates I expected to get in that PCR chamber. What would you do? Right? An interview question. You ask that person, what would you do? What's your next step?
Right.
It would be interesting to see what they say. Maybe your ideal candidate lists all those things I just talked about. They would list both running some quick tests and going back to do some modeling. Maybe that the person you already have on your team has a PhD in the modeling side. So what you're looking for in this next hire is the person that says, oh, I'm going to run down to the lab, throw some thermocouples in there, turn on the heater real quick, grab some data. Then I'm going to modify the thermal mass of it. And once I change that, I'm going to change the thermal conductivity of the film on the PCR chamber. We do all of those things together. I definitely think you can, understand how people think by giving them some little test, engineering problems like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. And it also, as you're talking, it brings up an interesting topic as you're trying to build these teams. And maybe we can wrap up with this thought to hammer home your diversity point. But you want to hire people that are unlike you, right? And we've heard that. And I think the reason why is because you need diversity, right? You need people who are thinking differently from you to complement you, to help you solve these problems that require all these different heads together in a room. And I do think, the people that we're interfacing with here at KeyTech, like, understand that. But it's good to hear it also in this podcast. And I think it's helpful for them also to kind of get some tips from us, right, on what are the most important hires to make when you're trying to build this team. It's the technical project manager, it's a systems engineer. Maybe those two need to have diverse, mindsets, right? So yeah, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, really, right? And there's a lot that you could get into on structuring these teams, how to run projects, how to manage them, how to lead them. But I feel like our clients are really struggling with building those teams, and that's really where I think they need to spend a lot of their time. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, totally agree. I think it's so easy to think about. Most of us are really good at a lot of aspects of life, but we all have weaknesses. And so, to your point of that diverse thinking, there, hiring people that fills in our weaknesses, that's how you make a really great team.
Yeah. Cool. All right, Brian. Thanks for your time today.
Always enjoy it. Anytime, man.
Yeah. All right. We got to give people what they want, man. So,
all right. See you next time, Andy.
All right. See you guys.